What does it mean to support Christian things? How does the Bible give us answers to how we're supposed to conduct ourselves in our political lives? And so along the course of time, I've talked about what is government and what is it for. I've talked about where does law come from? How do we know what's a good law and what's not a good law? And last week, I addressed the question, is America a Christian nation? So the first three messages were pretty broad. You know, they weren't dealing with a particular issue. They were more dealing with our overall set of beliefs about government and about our country that we should have as we approach any issue. Well, today, this is the first message that I'm delivering in this series that is about an issue or a complex of issues because the focus today is still rather broad. It's not just with one narrow thing, but it's with kind of a whole chunk of issues that we have to deal with in our democracy. And to start, I want to show the cover of the April 25th issue of Time magazine just a couple of weeks ago. It says this, or it said this: "Dear reader, you owe $42,998.12. That's what every American man, woman, and child would need to pay to erase the $13.9 trillion U.S. debt." Now, that is kind of a slap in the face to see that. You might wonder if, the doctor who gets that to put in his doctor's office is like, $42,998? No, I've been paying this. Where's the office manager? No. But this is, each human being in America would have to fork this over in order to cover the public debt. That is what the government of the United States, the federal government, has borrowed to pay its expenses, okay? I want to show you a chart from an organization called Fix the Debt that shows how the federal debt has changed over time. Now, this chart has to do with the ratio of debt to gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is basically a measure of the size of our economy. It's the size of our total economic output, so how much we do, the goods and the services we produce and so forth. And this is showing not raw debt, but the relationship between how much debt did we have at a given time publicly compared with how large our economy was at that time. It's sort of a rough comparison if you're thinking about your own household to how much debt you have compared to how much income you're earning in a year. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar. And it starts in 1790, okay? It starts way back with the debt that we had coming out of the Revolutionary War that we owed to the Netherlands and France and so forth. And as you can see, it gradually went down until it got paid off. There was zero public debt during the Jackson administration. Now, by the way, that was not good. It's not a good thing to have zero debt. It is a good thing for government to have small debt. It's not good to have zero debt. I'm not going to go into the details of why that is. But as you can see then, the Civil War came along and, the debt ballooned, went way up, and then gradually through the late 1800s, it got paid down. Then World War I came, so boom, the debt goes up again, and then during the 1920s, it started to get paid down. Then the Great Depression hits, boom, it goes up again, stays high, and then World War II hits, bang, it goes way up again, and then it got paid down very dramatically, then through the 1950s, 1960s. Then it started to swell again in the 1980s, especially 1970s, the 1980s, and then during the Clinton administration, the 1990s, the dot-com boom, it started to get paid down again, and then it blows up again. And it blows up during a war, but not a war to the level of World War II or World War I or the Civil War or the Revolutionary War. It blew up for many reasons, and I'm not going to get into the reasons and the blame and the why this and the why that and who's responsible and so forth. But the point is, right now, our debt in 2015, so last year, our measurement of it as a comparison to GDP is higher than it has been at any point since the World War II era. And just 9 years ago, it was 40% of the size of the economy, and we thought that it was bad then, okay? The debt is expected to be larger than the economy in about 20 years. And by the way, the reality is actually even worse than this, because back during World War II, when the public debt was really high, private debt was fairly low. In other words, the debt that individual households or businesses were carrying was fairly low. But today, private debt is enormous. So if you actually take all of the debt of our governments at all levels and us as individual households, businesses, corporations, and you put all that together, it is extraordinarily high compared to the size of our economy. Now, why is this bad? This is bad because the higher the debt, the less money there is in the country to invest in businesses that hire people and pay them. Interest rates for personal loans are likely to rise beyond what people can afford. They're low now, but they're not going to stay that way. Rather than invest in things that benefit the public good, like transportation, communication networks, scientific, medical, and military research and education, our governments will be paying for stuff that we've already bought. And we may even get to a point that banks and other nations stop lending us money because they think that we won't be able to pay it back. And when that happens, we are in for a catastrophe. Now, I don't want to talk about the past so much as I want to talk about the present and the future. So our public debt gets higher every year because the federal government spends more money than it brings in every year. That is called the budget deficit. So what is the federal government spending money on these days? Well, I'm glad you asked. This is also a chart by Fix the Debt. They call it their U.S. taxpayer receipt. It's showing that of every $100 that is paid in taxes to the federal government, here are the places that it goes. I don't know how well you can read this, but the top line is Social Security. $24.11 out of every $100 is spent on Social Security. $23.72 is spent on health, mostly Medicare and Medicaid. $21.49 of every 100 is spent on defense and military benefits. $6.54 is spent on interest, and then you have all the other things that are going down. Basically, the way it breaks down is that it's roughly a quarter to Social Security, a quarter to health, a quarter to discretionary spending on defense, and a quarter to discretionary spending on everything other than defense, except it's not exactly a quarter because we have this $6.54 of interest. In other words, of all the money that we take in, we spend, of $100 that we take in, we spend $6.54 on paying the interest on what we've already spent. And that number is going to get higher and higher and higher. As you saw that chart of how it goes up higher and higher and higher, that amount is going to get higher and higher and higher, which means there's going to be even less to spend on other things. But the other thing that's interesting about this is that a lot of the stuff that we can get into, quarrels and fights about how much money it costs, things like foreign aid, things like conservation, things like the space program, those are either like relatively small things on this list, or they're down in the other line at the very bottom, $3.87. The stuff that is really costing a lot of money, the stuff that's really causing the deficit to be large and causing the debt to grow, is those top four things on the list. So you look at interest. We talked about that. The third thing is defense. Now, obviously, we want defense, but you notice that in campaigns and so forth, there's a lot of talk about strengthening the military, right? That's a great thing to campaign on. Let's strengthen the military. Who's going to say, no, let's not strengthen the military? We want a weak military. Nobody's going to argue with that. And especially if you just sort of make a claim that's out there like, our military has gotten weak and we're going to strengthen it again. And there's like, oh, yeah, we're never going to strengthen it again. Absolutely. You probably would want to know that not only does the United States spend more on its military than any other nation in the world, but we also spend more than the next 7 countries put together. That's right. The United States spends more on defense than China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United Kingdom, India, France, and Japan combined. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into this. We're going to talk about that maybe at a later time of the pros and cons of that. But what I really want us to look at today is those top 2 items on the receipt: Social Security and health spending. Now, of course, we pay special taxes for these, as you know. You see those getting taken out of your paycheck. And these expenditures are commonly called entitlements. Have you ever heard this before? Entitlements or entitlement spending, right? Entitlement means there's something that is rightfully mine. And if you're the one who can give it to me, then you are responsible to see that I get it. Okay? That's what an entitlement is. Now, the question is, are we entitled to things from our government? Well, yes, we are. Entitlement, or another way to say it is rights, is the flip side of obligation. We saw in our first week that God instituted human government for a reason. Do you remember that? God instituted government to protect the weak from abuse from the strong. We saw that in our very first week, to protect the weak from abuse from the strong. And so are we entitled to that from our government? Yes, we are. Why do you think we're spending so much on defense? Okay? It's for government to fulfill that obligation to its citizens. People are genuinely entitled to that. Also, a government may choose to go beyond the minimum that God requires it to provide, and it may make promises of its own to its citizens. Now, if the government makes a promise to its citizens, basic fairness, basic justice requires the government to keep the promise. Just like if I make a promise to you, I'm required to keep my promise to you. That's the right thing to do. So yes, citizens are entitled to what the government has promised to them simply because promise breaking is wrong. But the problem is, these promises are breaking us. We can't afford the promises that we have made to ourselves. And so to try to stem the bleeding, people have been talking for a long time about reforming entitlements, which is to change the promises that the government has made to its people so that the government takes more in tax or it gives less in benefits. And people get really upset about this. People say, that's not fair. That's mine. I'm entitled to it. I even heard one guy say on the news one time, this is like a man on the street interview, tell the government to keep its filthy hands off my Medicare. This guy may not, one person gets the joke, this person may not be aware that it's the government's filthy hands that are actually giving the Medicare every month, okay? So members of Congress know this. They're not stupid. I'll say it again, they're not stupid. They know that they'll get thrown out of office if they do anything to change this. So they don't do anything. They just keep talking about it. They just keep talking about it and talking about it and talking about it. They don't do anything about it. And the debt gets worse and worse and worse. And the danger, it gets greater and greater and greater. Now, it's all well and good to wail about these entitled people. In fact, maybe you're one of these entitled people, and I'm wailing about you. But there's another kind of entitlement that is just as powerful and has every bit as much to do with our physical problems. And that is people's sense of entitlement to the money that they earn or gain from investment. Now listen, everybody, or at least nearly everybody, believes that citizens are entitled to a very large portion of the fruits of their individual labor. That if you work hard, then the produce of that is something that you receive. I mean, even Jesus says the worker deserves his wages. Okay? So everybody believes this, and it's practical too. When the Puritans came over from England to settle Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they settled in Boston in 1620, I believe it was, or around that time. That was Plymouth. Boston was a little bit later. But when they settled there, they were a religious community, and so they wanted to do things like the Book of Acts. So they said, you know what, we're a colonist, we're all in this together, and we're all going to plant together, and we're all going to work really hard, and then we're going to bring in the produce from the field, and then we're going to distribute that fairly among our households so that we can eat for the next year. Well, it didn't work very well. And so John Winthrop, the governor of the colony, said, next year we're doing it different. It's every household for themselves. You want to eat? You plant your own stuff. And they had a much bigger yield and a lot less poverty, a lot less starvation, a lot less death, literally death, the following winter. So this is a practical thing, that if you work hard, you deserve the money that you earn. But the entitlement that I'm talking about goes beyond that basic principle. I'm talking about the widespread belief that I am entitled to keep everything I earn. And that what the government takes is basically stealing that we more or less put up with. And in fact, I'm entitled to be able to get rich if I have the talent to do it, if I have the luck to do it. I'm entitled to garner all the wealth I can, whether I've earned it or whether I've just made good bets on what other people have earned via my investments. I'm entitled to get mine, whether the way I get it is useful to my neighbor or to society or to the economy, or whether it's just useful to me. And everybody else is entitled to do the same. But if I'm better at it than you, or if I have advantages that you don't have, well, tough luck. I win, you lose. That's the way the world works. This is the mindset that fuels greed. This is the mindset that fuels Wall Street both before and after the financial meltdown 8 years ago. This is why people go there and do what they do. And further, this has driven the ever-widening gap between rich and poor in our country, as real wages have stayed stagnant for 99% of the population and for more than a generation, but income has skyrocketed for the top 1%. Now, in fairness, the income gap is misleading. I mean, among other things, it doesn't take into account how much the top 1% are taxed, which is very, very high, or how much the government benefits the bottom 20% by giving various services and even money. And so the gap between the top 1% and the other 99, or the top 20% and the bottom 20%, is not as wide as Bernie Sanders says it is. But it is wide. And there's still a profound and undeniable difference between the richest and poorest Americans, and it's getting more extreme all the time, every year. So this is a scary complex of issues, isn't it? I mean, we have public debt that's careening out of control, and the prospect of less and less economic growth that will have devastating effects on our future and the future of our children and grandchildren and beyond. And at the same time, we have more and more Americans getting pressed harder and harder and even collapsing from fragile self-sufficiency into poverty, while a privileged few get richer and richer. And both of those issues are driven by a sense of entitlement. Both of them are driven by a sense of, I deserve what it is that I get. So does the Bible have anything to say about these issues to Christians who are trying to honor God as citizens? As a matter of fact, it does. It says a great deal. And what I'm going to share with you today is 3 policy principles that I believe should guide the positions that we support. And then I'm going to share with you 2 attitude adjustments that the Lord wants us to make that should guide what we're willing to do and what we're willing to accept in order to get on the right track. But before we get to these 3 policy principles and these 2 attitude adjustments, we're going to look at how God told ancient Israel to handle it. Because God actually gave Israel a law that was intended to address this sort of thing, even though their culture and their economy was very, very different than ours back in those days than ours is now. But we're going to look at how God told ancient Israel to handle it, because that's going to give us a big clue for the way forward. Now, in ancient Israel, at the time of the conquest, that is, at the time that God took his people, who were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, brought them out of slavery to Egypt by the hand of Moses, led them by Moses through the desert, and a generation died off, but we're not going to describe why that happened. And eventually, they get to the point where they're about to cross into the land of Canaan that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joshua, Moses' successor, was going to lead them in. At that time, the extremes of wealth and poverty were not far apart. I mean, in the camp there, you got to keep in mind that all the stuff that they had gotten from the Egyptians, that the Egyptians had actually given them wealth to say, get out of Egypt before our land is destroyed. Take anything we have, just get out of here, okay? And it says in the Bible, so the people plundered the Egyptians that way. And then as far as their other wealth, I mean, they had some livestock they were taking with them, and the food they were eating was manna. You remember the manna, right? It was the stuff, the dew came down from heaven every morning, and it evaporated, and when it evaporated, there was stuff there that they could turn into bread. Okay, so that's what they were eating. And so everybody was basically at the same level economically. Then they go and they conquer the land, and they distribute it. They survey it, they parcel it out. Each tribe gets its own bit, and then each clan within each tribe, and then each household within each clan, they get their own bit, and it's all laid out. So basically everybody has the same, more or less, the same starting point. But there were big problems with this arrangement, because the people were constantly subject to attacks by their neighbors. They were getting attacked from this side and attacked from that side, and people would come in and take stuff and leave it. And this happened because there was no discipline. They were worshiping foreign gods. They were worshiping other gods that God told them not to worship. And so he was sending these attackers so that they would wise up and get with it. And so what we read in the book of Judges, the very last line in the book of Judges that describes this situation for Israel, that was a chaotic, not good situation. The very last line says, at that time there was no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And it was not a good situation. This situation without government was not a good situation for the people. Okay? So there was general wealth equality, but with no government, they were still in bad shape. They were in really bad shape. And they were unsafe. And so they ended up getting a king. And when they got a king, they got organized. You had a king who was getting organized, who was beginning to get organized as far as organizing the people, as organizing a military to be able to defend the people, and so on and so forth. But this government required wealth to go. And plus, the king, as kings are wont to do, was taking plenty of money to just enrich himself and his family. And so taxes began to enter into the equation for Israel that did not exist before. And as the people started to pay taxes, again, you had a fairly narrow range of wealth and poverty, but those who were on the lower end got pressed harder by those taxes. And as they got pressed harder, they would have to pay tax, or they'd have to do whatever, and they wouldn't have it. They'd have to get the money to do that, or they'd have to get the livestock to pay to the king, or they'd have to get the commodities that they needed to pay to the king. And so they'd need to sell something that they had in order to get that. So they'd start to sell off their land. And then when they ran out of land, of course, once you sell off your land, now that's land you can't plant next year. And when you can't plant that land, then you have even less to eat, and you even have less to pay in tax. So you got to sell more land. But then you have even less than that, and so you got to sell more land. And so you keep selling land until you run out of land. And then what do you need to do in order to survive, in order to get food to eat now that you're not growing any? You sell yourself. You sell your family. You sell your children into slavery. So that you can have the money, so that you can have somebody else who's going to feed you, and so that you can get the money from the sale of yourself to pay off your debts. Okay? So as this happens more and more people are selling land, more and more people are selling themselves. And there's a few people at the top who are the privileged associates who have either made good on their investment in other people selling land and their bodies to them, or because they're connected to the government, that they're actually making more out of this whole deal. And so you have this situation growing in Israel through the centuries where you have a rich elite that's getting richer and richer. And then you had people who their ancestors were farmers that owned their land, who now are dispossessed from their land, and they're getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And the prophets in the Old Testament railed against this. Isaiah said, "Woe to you who add house to house and join field to field till no space is left and you live alone in the land." Isn't this profound? He's railing against the rich, saying, woe to you that you're making out so well on other people's poverty and other people's pain that in the end, you're alone. There's nobody left but yourself because you bought it all and you've driven them off of your property. Jeremiah had these profound denunciations against the kings in his day. And he said to one of these kings, God said to one of these kings through Jeremiah, "Woe to him who builds his palace by unrighteousness, his upper rooms by injustice, making his own people work for nothing, not paying them for their labor." He says, "I will build myself a great palace with spacious upper rooms." So he makes large windows in it, panels it with cedar, and decorates it in red. Does it make you a king to have more and more cedar? Did not your father have food and drink? He did what was right and just, so all went well with him. That's referring to King Josiah. He defended the cause of the poor and needy, and so all went well. Is that not what it means to know me? Declares the Lord. But your eyes and your heart are set only on dishonest gain, on shedding innocent blood, and on oppression and extortion. Kings were feeding themselves. They were getting rich, and their cronies were getting rich at the expense of the poor, when what their job was to do exactly the opposite. What their job was to do was to execute and enforce a whole series of laws that God had given people through Moses long before there was a king, that were designed to protect people who got into such poverty that they lost their land. And I want to share those with you in summary. This is just a sample. And it doesn't even count basics like not stealing or murdering or taking bribes, which all hurts the poor more than it hurts the rich. Okay? Here's the laws that we can see, and again, you can find references to these in the insert in your bulletin that I'm putting in here every week with the scriptures. Here are Israel's laws to protect and restore the poor. First, laborers get paid every day. If you were working for somebody as a day laborer, you got paid that night. You don't get it waiting. Your employer doesn't hold on to it and say, well, later on this week I'll pay you. No, you pay them that day rather than withhold their wages, because they need to buy bread that day to eat that night. Secondly, the weekly Sabbath. the resting on the seventh day. Resting on the seventh day honored God and respected God, but also it was a thing for the whole community. So it's not just that I'm resting on the Sabbath and not doing any work, but I'm not making you do any work either. I'm not driving you hard so that you have to work 7 days a week. Okay? Everybody, even the poorest person, gets to rest. Gleanings. The Israelites were told, when you're harvesting your field, don't harvest all the way to the edge. So there was supposed to be this sort of margin or border around the outside of every field that the grain was still standing up and it wasn't harvested. And also, if you harvest anything, or if you're harvesting grapes, if you drop anything, don't pick it up. Because the poor people who have lost their land, who don't have any land of their own to harvest, they go into those other fields and they're allowed to pick up what's left. They're allowed to pick up what's dropped. They're allowed to pick up what's left around the outside. The tithe of the third year. Every year, the Israelites were supposed to take their agricultural produce and take 1/10 of it to the temple to give to God. But they did that for 2 years in a row, but on the third year, instead of going to the temple, they brought it into the center of their towns, and the poor people took whatever they needed and whatever they wanted. It was all distributed directly to the poor. No interest lending. When a person got into a situation where they needed money for something and they went to their fellow Israelite and said, I need money for thus and such, the Israelite was not allowed to say no to them. They were required to lend them money, and they were required to lend them money at no interest. They were allowed to lend at interest to non-Israelites, but among their fellow Israelites, they were not allowed to lend at interest. They were not allowed to make money off of somebody else's poverty. Now, I don't think that this law, there are differences of opinion on this. I don't think that this was necessarily a law against capitalism. I don't think that this was necessarily a law against borrowing at interest or lending at interest in order to expand one's business or something like that. This was about lending money to poor people and making money off of their poverty. Okay? This is like in our own country and situation today, predatory lending. You know, payday lending, right? It's like basically, I'm going to make money off of your poverty. You know, you need money right now. I have money right now. I'm going to make money off the fact that you need the money right now to eat, to live, not just to grow or expand your business. Okay? Israelites were not allowed to do that. There were limitations on the collateral that they took. So, for example, when they lent money, they could take collateral. They could take something as a pledge. They weren't allowed to take a millstone, which was used to grind grain. Because if they took that, then the person wouldn't be able to eat. They were not allowed to take a widow's clothes. They were allowed to take somebody's cloak, somebody's jacket, but only during the day. And at night, they had to give it back to him until the next morning. Why? Because the poor person used their clothes as their blanket, and they would freeze at night. Israelites weren't allowed to take that kind of collateral from each other. There was redemption within the family, which meant that whenever you had to sell land, you tried, if you could, to sell it to somebody in your family who was going to then take care of you. You know? Or if you had to sell yourself or sell your child, you were to sell yourself to a family member. And family members were required to redeem. Were required to buy that person, to buy that person's land in order to keep them going, and so to keep things within the family and to support one another that way. There were limitations on slavery. Slavery did exist, but there were limitations. The limitations were if you were an Israelite and you sold yourself into slavery to another Israelite, they couldn't keep you for more than 6 years. On the 7th year, they had to let you go free. And when they let you go free, they were required to actually give you gold and silver and livestock and as much as they could so that you could get on your feet once you left rather than immediately having to sell yourself to somebody else. This was part of the requirement. This was part of the rules. And then there was the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee was the 50th year. It was a 50-year cycle. And on the 50th year, the law was that all the slaves were freed. All outstanding debts were canceled. And all property, all land, went back to the family that had sold it within the previous 50 years. There was a reset button that was pushed every 50 years. That was God's intention. So that as 50 years went on and some people got more wealthy and some people got more poor, there would be a reset button that pushed those two closer together. Now, it wasn't a complete reset button because it didn't redistribute gold and silver, didn't redistribute livestock, but it did redistribute land. And the land was the basis for life. The land was the basis for self-sufficiency economically for the next 50 years. So these were the things that God told Israel to do. These were the things that God told the kings to do. He actually designed laws that had the explicit intention of redistributing wealth from the wealthy to the poor in such a way that would prevent the rich from getting too rich and the poor from getting too poor. So, what are the policy principles that we can take from this? Well, first is simply this. Just law requires the rich to restore the poor. This is God's plan. Just law requires the rich to restore the poor. A tax that pretends that the rich are not rich and that the poor are not poor is not a fair tax. There's a lot of talk about flat tax, where everybody pays the same amount. We have something like this in the state of Pennsylvania. We have a flat income tax, although for people at the very bottom of the ladder, there's tax forgiveness. But then after a certain point that's a fairly low threshold, then it becomes flat all the way, 3.07%, okay? A flat tax is a simple tax, and people claim that it's a fair tax because everybody's taxed at the same amount. But not everybody is the same. A flat tax is not a fair tax because the rich are not the poor. They're simply not. And the middle are not the rich or the poor. We're simply not. So there's this question, this debate. Does the government have the right to take some of the hard-earned wealth of the wealthy and distribute it to the poor? According to what God says, the government doesn't just have the right to do that. The government has the obligation to do that. But that leads to our second principle, and that is that restoring the poor means restoring them to productive work. Restoring the poor means restoring them to productive work. Because the nature of poverty isn't just that you don't have money. It's not just that you're hungry. It's not just that you don't have possessions. Poverty is a breaking down of the self and breaking one's relationships to self, to others, to stuff, to the world, to the creation, even to God. Poverty breaks down dignity. And giving charity that does not restore dignity isn't ultimately helpful for people. A redistribution of wealth that doesn't restore the poor to productive work isn't good for poor people, as well as not being good for all of us. Because to show that a person has dignity is to show that we as a society believe in you, that we as a society believe that you have something to contribute to society. We believe that you have something that you can do that is going to serve others in some way. And so we want to restore you to the ability to do that. Notice the Old Testament pattern. When they were restored, when the poor was restored, what were they restored to? They were restored to work. They were restored to the ability to grow crops again. They were restored to the ability to work hard again that they didn't have before. It wasn't just a gift, but it was the opportunity to work hard. In the New Testament, we have the situation with churches in urban areas, much more like our situation today, even though it was 2,000 years ago. Churches in urban areas that when there were poor within those churches, people would give of their own to support them. But Paul made very, very clear that this was not an excuse for not working. He says famously in 2 Thessalonians, "For you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example. We were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's food without paying for it. For even when we were with you, we gave you this rule: the one who is unwilling to work shall not eat." Okay? Now, what's very interesting about this is that in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was reforming, and many believed dismantling, the welfare state in that country. And she famously gave a speech to the bishops of the Church of England where she quoted this verse in defense of her policies, which caused a great deal of controversy and quite an uproar that she would do that. But about 15 years later, Tony Blair, who was prime minister at that time, of the Labor Party, definitely a leftist party, even he, reflecting on that incident with Thatcher, agreed there is a basic principle that those who get benefits from a community need to contribute to the community in some way. Can't just be takers, but have to be givers to some extent. We need to remove disincentives to work from our redistribution policies. Now, we made strides in this in the 1990s with welfare reform in our country, but today I've noticed that the jackpot is disability. And I hate to say that. I mean, and believe me, I want you to hear me loud and clear. There is such a thing as disability. And there is great value that I support 100% in people being supported who are literally unable to work. I strongly believe in that. Strongly believe in that. But I have to say that I, and maybe you too, have run into too many people who are waiting and hoping to get on disability rather than waiting and hoping to be healed. That they would rather be on disability than to be healed of the infirmity that is causing their problem right now. That they don't have the desire to be restored to the dignity of contributing to the world in some way. Which I think even for people who are in disability, everybody's valuable. Everybody's precious. Everybody's valuable. Everybody has something to give. The developmentally disabled person has something to give. The person who's physically disabled has something to give. And we should expect that for them as well as for us. The third policy principle is that restoring the poor should strengthen families, not weaken them. Again, in the Old Testament pattern, when the poor were in trouble, it was expected that their family, including extended family, was going to come around and embrace them. It actually strengthened families. In the ancient church, when there were widows who they didn't have a husband and they couldn't get work themselves because there really was no, or very little way, not no way, but very little way for a single woman to go get a job in the ancient Mediterranean world, that the church embraced those widows and they helped them to eat. But Paul made very clear that the first line of defense was the family. That if the widow had children, they should be taking care of her. If she had grandchildren, they should be taking care of her. If she had brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, they should be taking care of her. As the first line of defense. Only somebody who didn't have that family support system should be supported by the whole church. Paul went so far as to say, anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Those are strong words. Now again, this is not to hurt anybody here today who's unemployed. That's not what Paul is talking about, okay? That's not what he's talking about at all. What he's talking about is somebody who has the means but would rather the church take care of my relative's problem than me taking care of my relative's problem. And our laws today, by and large, do not encourage families to take care of the poor in their families. They are inclined to substitute the state for the family. And one of the big questions and challenges is, for example, how do we help single moms without incentivizing single motherhood? I mean, single moms, holy cow. I mean, you want to talk about people whom God loves. God loves single moms. God cares about single moms. God has compassion on single moms. And we should too. And how do we do that practically without incentivizing single motherhood in such a way that it's a person who's being helped and fed by the state without any other broader family system that's helping that person out? That's an open question. I don't have an answer to that, but that needs to be our objective. And we need intelligent, biblically based public policy thinkers and politicians to be working on this kind of thing. So those are three policy principles. What are the two attitude adjustments that you and I can make? And that you and I can make as we approach these issues in our voting and in our lives? The first one is, we're all in this together. We are all in this together. And by this, I mean that scary looking line chart, where it goes up in the end. That's going to hurt us all, okay? We're all in this together, and it's really, really easy to find somebody else to blame. Some middle-class people blame the poor. Some middle-class people blame the rich. I don't hear any middle-class people blaming the middle class. But it's always somebody else's problem, right? It's always somebody else's problem. But you know what? It's all of our problem. It doesn't really matter how we got here. We all got to get ourselves out. And let me tell you something. I mean, it's not just all wealth levels, but it's both all wealth levels and all generations. I mean, there's a common thought among many people that if we could just soak the top 1%, then we'd be okay. Let me tell you something. That line chart that I showed you, the top 1%, even if we took all of their money, which would be completely economically destructive, there is still not enough in the top 1% to solve the problem of that line chart. Seriously, it is that bad, okay? But also from the entitlement perspective, all of us generations are in this together. It is an expectation that we are supposed to honor the aged. It actually says in the Proverbs to rise before the aged, to honor the gray-headed. And then God will be with you if you do this, okay? And so much of our entitlement spending is doing that. It is honoring the aged, and we should and we must, okay? But at the same time, Paul pointed out in 2 Corinthians that it's parents who save for their children, not children for their parents. And we have an entitlement system that what it is doing is, while it is supporting the aged, and rightly so, is putting their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, their great-great-grandchildren into worse and worse and worse and worse and worse in the situation that they're going to have to deal with when they grow up and they start working. The world that they are going to inherit, the world that my kids, my grandkids are going to inherit, is a scary place if we do not do something about that bar chart. It is bad, bad news. So the point is, we're all in it together, people, okay? We're all going to suffer. Rich, poor, old, young, present, future, we're all in it. So we all got to get together and be willing to sacrifice and give for the common good. I mean, are we here today willing to re-elect the person who will raise my taxes and cut my benefits for the sake of the common good? Are we willing to do that? I mean, that's why they haven't done it yet. And if you think if we just cut spending, it'll be fine. There is not enough spending to cut to bring that line down. If we just grow the economy, it'll be fine. We cannot grow it fast enough to bring that line down. It's a combination of cutting, of raising taxes, and of growing the economy. That's the only way that it's going to happen. But that requires people who are willing to say, all right, I'm willing to take on some more of that burden. I'm willing for the effects that it's going to be on my household. I'm going to do that. And that comes to our second thing, our second attitude adjustment, from I deserve to I serve. Because at the root of our physical problem is an entitlement mindset among all Americans. And that is based on I deserve. Let me tell you something, brothers and sisters. We don't deserve anything that we have. I mean, at one basic level, we don't deserve anything. One of my favorite verses in the Bible, it's my dad's life verse. It's 1 Corinthians 4, I believe, verse 9. What do you have that you did not receive? I mean, really. No matter how hard you've worked, no matter how hard you've earned, where did you get the wherewithal to work that hard? Who taught you how to work that hard? Why are you in a place where you can get that job and somebody else is not living in that place? There's all kinds of forces all around that have helped us that we often don't give credit to. And frankly, when we really ask what we deserve, what do you and I as a human being deserve? We deserve hell. That's what we deserve. We deserve the wrath of God. The fact that we're living and breathing right now, the fact that God allows humans a period of living that they actually get the chance to repent of their sins instead of being annihilated immediately, that is grace. It says in the Bible that God causes the rain to fall on the fields of the righteous and on the fields of the wicked. Right? We don't deserve anything. But what the Bible also says, Jesus said, freely you have received, freely give. To go from a mindset of I deserve to I serve. Because that is the gospel. The gospel is that we don't have to go to hell. The gospel is that God sent his son and gave his son to us so that we could live forever with him if we trust and believe in him. That is the gospel. It is grace. It is giving. And we've received it. So what is going to be our attitude? Are we going to be, gracious in giving privately, but we're not going to be gracious in giving publicly? You can't afford to pay down the debt, neither can I. Your household is going to get hurt by it, so will mine. But let me ask you, how many times have you found in your household a situation where you just found a way to make it work? You had some unexpected repair that you had to make. You had some expected expense that your kids accrued or whatever, and you didn't have the money, but somehow you found a way to make it work. This is one of these things where we got to find a way to make it work. And if we're willing to do that with our own household, why can't we do it for our country? We can and we should give voluntarily, but we can and should also give by supporting laws that support the good of all. And let me tell you something, there's a blessing in this. Not only a blessing for your own spirit and soul for the day to come, as God says, well done, thank you for representing me in your generosity, but also in this age right now. In that scripture that Isaiah read, was read for us from the book of Isaiah, here's how it concludes. This is God's promise. Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter, when you see the naked to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Here's the promise. Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here am I. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger, it's their fault, and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. Let's pray. Lord our God, we want that vision for our country. We want that vision for every country in the world. We want to see that. We know we won't see it perfectly until Jesus returns, but we know there's bits and pieces of it that we can experience now by following you in your ways. We humble ourselves and ask that you would adjust our attitudes so that we don't have the mindset of I deserve, but I serve. And that you would do as you promised, and enable what we need to satisfy us as a nation, as we're willing to serve the generation who is not our own, as we're willing to serve the person of the class that is not our own, as we are willing to love as you love, and to do justice. We pray this, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Please stand for the benediction, for the final blessing. In your bulletins today is our famous response card. I think you guys all know how this works. I invite you to please fill that